The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, President of the Portuguese Republic. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, President of the Portuguese Republic, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Madam Vice Secretary General, Your Excellencies, what a happy coincidence it is to follow at this rostrum President João Lourenço from the border country of Angola. 20 years after the referendum that opened the door to the independence of Timor-Leste, thus confirming the strength of a community of peoples of Portuguese language, which is taking steps towards greater internal mobility. Mr. President, I ask you to convey President Ramalganda's our congratulations on his election for the symbolism of the presence of the African continent, to which we are bound by ties of affection, deep friendship, and respect. I also thank your predecessor, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, always tireless and warm-hearted in the exercise of her role. Madam Vice Secretary General, Portugal welcomes and reaffirms its support for all the priorities that you have pursued, that Secretary General Antonio Guterres has pursued in his coherent, dynamic, and resolute mandate, defending an effective multilateralism based on international law and the Charter of the United Nations, and its legal extension to new global realities such as the oceans, combating terrorism and artificial intelligence, and also the reform of the United Nations system in conflict prevention within the context of development cooperation, peacekeeping, human rights, particularly those of children, youth, and women, concerned with migration and refugees, and always the 2030 Agenda and all its expressions. Yesterday, with the success of the Climate Action Summit, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, the Ocean Conference, the Digital Cooperation Initiative, and the Plan of Action to Safeguard Religious Sites. Your Excellencies, we should recall that 100 years ago, the League of Nations was born, and the initiative of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who signed the treaty establishing it, but upon returning home, saw an isolationist Congress reject its ratification based on isolationist positions. The United States of America, which had been the starting point of what might have been a new international order, shunned the new organization and never took up the place of permanent member of its deliberative body. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics also did not wish to join the founders of the League of Nations for ideological reasons, only joining that body too late. Without the U.S., and for a long time without the USSR, the League of Nations, which was itself conceived for a still imperial and colonial world that was coming to an end, never recovered from the lack of commitment of one of the world powers and the late entry of other coexisting with the growth of ever more hyper-nationalist, isolationist, and unilateralist leaderships. It was a failure of an attempt to embrace multilateralism. And precisely 80 years ago, the Second World War began. What had appeared to be a promise, however precarious, in 1919 had become a hecatomb by 1939. Notwithstanding the differences in time frame and style, it is worth stopping and reflecting for a moment on the lessons of that still near past, now that we are entering the United Nations' 75th year of existence. We consider that it is worth fighting for more international law to help steer relations between states and peoples, that it is worth fighting for international organizations to help solve problems that affect everyone, not just a few, and that it is worth fighting for a political and not just a technical role for these organizations, that it is worth fighting for a multilateral vision shared by everyone, including those deemed most powerful, because nobody is an island and nobody can, alone or with a handful of allies, address the increasingly complex problems affecting everyone. It is worth learning with history, and not to mistake transitory power or leadership for eternity. We have seen in the last 40 to 50 years too many changes. The world had two superpowers and now has one superpower, an absolute superpower. And multilateralism is required. In 40 or 40 years down the road, how has the world changed, and how important it is to have dialogue in preventing conflict and have initiatives on common goals. We need to resist the temptation to gaze at our own self, our power, our upcoming election, the immediate demands of difficult times or of rapid change. A model of ignoring others, of not accepting others, rejecting others, pretending that the rest of the world does not exist, and that the rest of the world can only exist if it resembles us. Your Excellencies, Portugal, in line with Secretary General Antonio Guterres' guidance, calls for multilateralism, for the investment in international organizations, for the alignment of the 2030 agenda, for the payment on time and in full of the assessed contributions, for the United Nations reform of management, development system, and peace and security architecture. We continue to consider it to be important to readjust the Security Council, involving at least the presence of Africa, Brazil, and India. We advocate for participation in peacekeeping operations, for the adoption of the resolution on the moratorium on the death penalty, for the engagement in COP25 in Chile, for the conclusion of the Treaty on Marine Biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. At the same time, Portugal is proud of its participation in 8 peacekeeping operations, 6 of them in Africa, where we also involved in European Union training and capacity building missions, especially in MINUSCA, where Portugal has a quick reaction force, which is truly essential for the protection of civilians. We are also proud to organize in Lisbon, together with Kenya, in July 2020, the United Nations Ocean Conference, together also with the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. We take pride in the launch of the National Roadmap for Carbon Neutrality 2050, an instrument for economic competitiveness, employment, wealth, and social justice. We recall the success of the Lisbon Plus 21 Conference of Ministers for Youth. We present the traditional resolution on policies and programs involving youth, and we draw attention to our measures for the promotion of women's rights in the most effective and intensive 40 years of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and in the 25 years of the Beijing Conference. We not only support the Global Pact for Migrations and Refugees, as well as we have approved the National Implementation Plan. We are a country of migrants ever since our birth almost 9 centuries ago, and we have millions of Portuguese citizens spread all over the world. We combat xenophobia and intolerance. We view education as a priority, as shown by the Global Support Platform for Syrian Students, which is an initiative of President Jorge Sampaio. And we advocate for inclusive and sustainable development in the countries of origin in order to prevent and eradicate terrorism, radicalization, and human trafficking, as well as safeguarding peace and the rights of people and communities. Your Excellencies, in this autumn of 2019, we are facing global and regional signs pointing in opposite directions, some of them worrisome, others regrettably fewer in number, favorable, or even promising. In the international scene, we see a rush to a trade war or an economic and financial war or a currency war. At the same time, we see an open arms race, the cyber presence as a common or almost common means of external intervention, the disinvestment in international law and international organizations. We see a few of the most obvious examples in the world, such as in Yemen, Libya, and despite the steps taken to resolve the situation in Syria, and as well as the more acute situation in the Sahel. We are favorable on the advancement of maternal and child health, the agreement between the EU and Mercosur, which hopefully will go hand in hand with a shared sensitivity to environmental challenges. We are favorable toward a new hope for the Republic of North Macedonia. We are favorable to the window that will hopefully stay open regarding the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and a stable transition in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and more promising developments in Eastern Africa. Equally wise are the visions for closer cooperation between the United Nations and the African Union, or between the European Union and the African Union. Portugal, which was directly involved in the first Europe-Africa summits, is willing to organize the next meeting of European Union and African Union leaders during its upcoming presidency of the Council of the European Union in 2021. In short, we see favorable perspectives. We must stay on this path. And on this path, we will not only be multilateralists, but true patriots in our own countries. To be a patriot is to have pride in the past, is to have pride in our roots, in our history. It is also to know exactly the world as it is, that others are also entitled to be proud of their own countries, and that the world, when they are not islands, is the result of a dialogue and the meeting of a patriotic spirit of all of us. Excellencies,
living in the United Nations, only those that do not know history and therefore do not mind repeating the mistakes of the past minimize the role of United Nations. In this room, happily, we are all patriots because we love our motherland, our roots, our history, and wish the best for our present and our future. And the best is not ignoring the world we live in and how we all depend upon so many others. We patriots, we know we need more, not less United Nations. Let us not repeat 100 years afterwards the same mistakes of the League of Nations. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.
thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Portuguese Republic for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the head of state.